The mist hung heavy over the river that autumn morning, painting the landscape in shades of gray and silver. Jacob Miller, a seasoned kayaker from Oregon, dipped his paddle into the calm current, expecting nothing more than a tranquil ride through familiar waters. He had always loved these early hours, the quiet before the world awoke, the rhythmic pull of his arms against the current, the way the fog transformed the river into something otherworldly. To him, it was more than exercise, it was meditation. But then it happened. A sound tore through the silence, sharp and jarring, so out of place in the serene wilderness that Jacob froze mid-stroke. At first, he thought it was just a bird's distressed cry, echoing strangely through the trees. But seconds later, it came again, louder this time, raw with panic. His heart hammered as he scanned the foggy shoreline. This was no bird. It was something else, something alive and in trouble. Jacob's first instinct was denial. Maybe it was a trick of the forest, the way sound bends in the mist. He told himself to keep going, to focus on the water ahead. Yet something about that cry clung to him. It was too urgent, too full of pain to ignore. He set his paddle down across the kayak, straining to listen. Another cry pierced the air, this one so close it sent a chill racing down his spine. It was not only desperate, it sounded eerily human. The veteran outdoorsman felt a surge of unease. Encounters in the wild were rarely predictable, and he knew better than most how quickly situations could turn dangerous. But his curiosity and something deeper, an instinct to help, pushed him forward. With cautious strokes, he steered his kayak toward the sound. The fog thickened, swallowing him in a world where shapes blurred and distance became meaningless. Every splash of his paddle seemed unnaturally loud against the hush of the morning. As he drifted closer to the bank, a new sound joined the chorus, a frantic thrashing, water being churned by something large and struggling. Jacob's breath caught. Through the shifting curtain of mist, he caught a glimpse of movement, a dark, flailing shape in the river, half hidden by reeds. For a fleeting second, his mind insisted it was a log pulled loose by the current. But then the shape moved again, with an unmistakable force of life. Jacob's pulse quickened. He leaned forward, narrowing his eyes against the fog. What he saw made the hair on his neck stand on end. Something, or someone, was trapped in the icy water, fighting desperately to stay afloat. The cries now carried clearly across the river, hoarse and filled with terror. Jacob tightened his grip on the paddle, his thoughts a blur. He came here for peace. Instead, he was about to face a decision that could change everything. Jacob's kayak slid closer to the sound, the water around him rippling with each careful stroke. His eyes strained against the shifting fog, and then he saw it clearly. A deer, its antlers tangled in a mass of river reeds, fighting for its life. The powerful animal was half submerged, thrashing wildly, its dark eyes wide with panic. Each desperate movement only tightened the reeds around its neck and antlers, dragging it further into the current. For a moment, Jacob sat frozen. He had seen deer countless times on his trips, usually as fleeting silhouettes vanishing into the woods. But this was different. This was a living creature on the edge of drowning. The water surged against its chest, pulling it down. Its breaths came in ragged bursts, clouds of vapor rising into the cold air before vanishing into the mist. Jacob's instinct screamed at him to act, but another voice, quieter and colder, warned of the risks. A cornered animal was dangerous, more dangerous than most predators. He knew this well. His years of navigating the wilderness had taught him that fear drove creatures to unpredictable extremes. A deer might seem harmless, but up close, with hooves sharp enough to shatter bone and antlers built for battle, it could inflict fatal damage if it panicked. And Jacob was in a kayak, a narrow strip of fiberglass, offering little protection if the animal lashed out. His grip on the paddle tightened. He could turn back. Nobody would know. He could pretend he hadn't heard the cries, that the fog had hidden it from him. But as he looked into the deer's eyes, glinting with terror above the waterline, something inside him refused. It wasn't just an animal he saw. It was a plea for help. Raw, silent, and undeniable. Jacob's mind raced through possibilities. He couldn't simply paddle away. But what could he do? A life preserver would be useless here. The reeds held the animal too firmly. Rope. He had rope. His gear bag contained a length of climbing rope he always carried for emergencies. The thought sparked hope, but it was immediately chased by fear. To use it, he would need to get dangerously close. The river pressed its urgency on him. Every second drained the deer's strength, its struggles growing weaker, its head dipping dangerously low with each wave. The sight of its ears barely breaking the surface cut through Jacob's hesitation. He didn't have time for perfect solutions. He had to try now. He maneuvered his kayak carefully, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The deer's eyes flicked toward him, wild with fear, and it let out another strangled cry. The sound carried raw desperation, piercing through the mist like a warning bell. Jacob steadied himself, whispering softly as if his words could calm the animal. His voice was quiet, barely audible over the water, but it was all he could offer, reassurance that he meant no harm. With trembling fingers, he reached into his gear bag and pulled out the rope. The coarse fibers felt heavy in his hands, heavier than they should. He began to fashion a crude loop, his mind working on instinct, recalling techniques from climbing trips years ago. The plan was simple, almost absurd. Throw the loop over the deer's antlers, tighten it, and try to free it from the reeds. His first attempt failed miserably. The rope splashed against the water's surface, startling the deer into another round of frantic thrashing. The kayak rocked dangerously under him, water lapping at the edges. He pulled the rope back quickly, steadying himself with a deep breath. He could feel the river's cold biting through his clothes, his heart pounding against his ribs. The deer was weakening, its movements less violent, its cries hoarse. Jacob knew the next attempt might be his only chance. He adjusted the loop, his hands steady now despite the adrenaline surging through him. With deliberate precision, he tossed the rope again. This time, it landed perfectly. The loop slid over the deer's antlers, catching against the tangle of reeds. Jacob pulled tight, bracing himself as the animal jerked in response. For a terrifying second, he thought the kayak would overturn, the weight of the struggling deer dragging him into the water. But he held firm, the rope biting into his palms, his arms straining with the effort. The fight was far from over. The reeds clung stubbornly, the current pressed harder, and Jacob knew the next few moments would decide everything. The rope held fast, but the deer's panic surged like a storm. It thrashed with renewed energy, sending sheets of water splashing against Jacob's kayak. Each violent jerk threatened to capsize him, his vessel rocking dangerously in the waves. His muscles screamed as he braced himself, gripping the rope with both hands, the coarse fibers cutting into his skin. He could feel every ounce of the animal's desperation coursing through the line, a raw force of survival that threatened to pull them both under. "Easy, easy," Jacob muttered through clenched teeth, though he knew his words meant nothing to the frantic creature. Still, speaking out loud steadied him, reminded him he was human, rational, in a moment that felt like chaos incarnate. The reeds clung stubbornly to the antlers, knotted by the river's current. Jacob leaned forward, using the rope not to restrain but to guide. Slowly, he drew the kayak closer, inch by inch, fighting against both the deer's strength and the water's pull. Every movement felt like balancing on the edge of disaster. One slip of his paddle, one wrong pull, and the river would swallow them both. The deer's eyes, wild and white-rimmed with fear, locked onto him. Jacob's stomach twisted. There was no malice in that gaze, only terror. He recognized it too well. The same look he'd seen in people pulled from accidents, hikers lost in storms. It was the universal face of life clinging to its last chance. At last, the kayak drifted close enough. Jacob reached into the cold water, his fingers brushing the slick surface of the reeds. The chill bit into his skin, shocking his nerves awake. The reeds were thick, tangled like a cruel net. Pulling them free by hand was impossible. He cursed under his breath, fumbling for the small utility knife strapped to his vest. His hands trembled as he flicked it open. One wrong move, one slip, and he could injure the animal, or himself. The deer bucked again, nearly overturning the kayak, but Jacob held his ground, jamming the paddle against the riverbed for stability. He leaned forward, knife flashing as he began slicing through the reeds. Each strand resisted, fibrous and stubborn, snapping free only after repeated sawing. The deer's breath came in ragged bursts, steam rising from its nostrils in the cold air. Its struggles weakened, not from calm, but from exhaustion. The more Jacob cut, the more the current pressed against them, dragging both man and beast downstream. His arms burned, his lungs heaved, and the knife slipped dangerously close to his own leg more than once. Still, he pressed on. Finally, with a sharp snap, the last strand gave way. The sudden release nearly sent Jacob tumbling backward. The deer surged upward, its head breaking fully above the water. For one terrifying second, Jacob thought it would bolt, ripping the rope from his hands and capsizing him in the process. But the animal's strength was almost gone. Instead of fighting, it collapsed against the pull of the current, its body bobbing weakly beside the kayak. Jacob gasped for air, clutching the rope tight, his chest heaving with both fear and relief. He had freed it, but now what? The deer was too weak to swim to shore on its own. Its weight pressed heavily against the line, dragging his kayak off course. The current was strong, pushing them both toward deeper waters. Jacob's mind raced. He couldn't simply cut it loose. It would drown within minutes. He had no choice but to tow it. He adjusted his position, looping the rope around the kayak's cleat to distribute the weight. Then, digging his paddle deep into the current, he began the slow, grueling process of steering toward the nearest bank. Every stroke was a battle, the kayak sluggish under the drag of the half-conscious animal. His shoulders burned, his palms raw from rope burn, but he forced himself onward. The shoreline appeared through the thinning mist, still agonizingly far. Jacob's muscles trembled, his body pushed past its limits, but he refused to stop. Each glance at the deer reminded him what was at stake. The heaving chest, the eyes half-lidded with exhaustion, the life balanced on the edge of surrender. Minutes stretched into eternity. The kayak inched closer to land, scraping against submerged rocks as the water shallowed. Jacob's arms shook violently as he fought to keep balance, the deer's body bumping against the hull with each swell. At last, the bank was within reach. With a final desperate push, Jacob grounded the kayak on the muddy shore. He collapsed forward, chest against the deck, lungs screaming for air. The deer lay half-submerged beside him, its body trembling, its breath shallow but steady. Jacob dropped the paddle, water dripping from his hair into his eyes. He stared at the animal, and for a brief moment, the world went silent. No river, no wind, no birdsong, only the sound of two beings who had fought death and survived. The true test, however, was only beginning. Jacob sat motionless for a moment, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The deer lay beside the kayak, its massive body half in the water, half on the muddy bank. Steam rose faintly from its soaked fur as the chill of the morning air met the heat of its exertion. For an instant, Jacob allowed himself to believe it was over, that he had won. But then the deer twitched violently, a sudden burst of panic shaking its frame. Its hooves lashed out, splashing water high into the air. The kayak rocked, mud sprayed across Jacob's arms, and his instincts screamed at him to retreat. Even weakened, the animal was dangerous. One well-placed kick could shatter bone. He scrambled backward, boots sinking into the soft riverbank. His knife still hung from his vest, but he had no intention of using it unless he had to. The deer staggered, its legs buckling beneath its weight. For a terrifying second, Jacob thought it might collapse back into the river and undo everything he had fought for. He lunged forward on instinct, gripping the rope still tangled around its antlers, guiding it toward firmer ground. The animal resisted, eyes wide with fear, nostrils flaring. Its chest heaved with every shallow breath. "Easy," Jacob whispered. his voice barely more than a rasp. "You're safe now, just easy." He didn't know why he spoke. The deer couldn't understand him. Yet the words steadied Jacob as much as they seemed to steady the animal. Step by trembling step, it moved forward until its hooves finally sank into solid earth. Water poured from its coat, creating dark streaks in the mud. The two of them stood there, man and beast, locked in a moment of fragile truce. Jacob's heart thundered, but he stayed still, his hands raised slightly as if approaching a wild horse. The deer's ears flicked, its gaze darting between him and the forest beyond. Its muscles quivered, caught between fight and flight. Then slowly it lowered its head. Jacob felt his breath catch. The movement wasn't aggression, it was exhaustion. The animal's strength was gone. Its legs folded beneath it, and it sank onto the bank with a heavy thud. Jacob exhaled, tension spilling from his body. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. The deer's sides heaved, its eyes half closed. It had survived the water, but barely. Jacob dropped to his knees, unsure of what to do. He wasn't a veterinarian, wasn't trained to treat wild animals, but instinct told him the creature needed warmth, rest, and time. He slipped off his jacket, ignoring the chill that instantly bit into his skin, and laid it gently across the animal's neck. The gesture felt absurd, a thin layer of fabric against the raw brutality of nature, but it was all he had. The deer didn't resist. It let out a long, shuddering breath, its body trembling under the strain of survival. Jacob sat beside it, his back against the kayak, every muscle in his body aching. The river's mist began to lift, revealing the forest bathed in pale morning light. For the first time since the cries had shattered his peaceful paddle, the world felt still again. Minutes passed in silence. Jacob studied the animal, watching the slow rise and fall of its chest, the way its ears twitched faintly at distant sounds. A strange connection rooted itself inside him, not of ownership or dominance, but of shared struggle. They had both fought the river, and in that fight they had both been changed. Then came the moment he had dreaded. The deer stirred. Its head lifted weakly, eyes blinking open. Jacob's body tensed. This was the turning point. The animal was recovering, and with recovery came instinct. If it saw him as a threat, if it lashed out now, he had no protection. The deer's gaze settled on him. For a long heartbeat, neither moved. Jacob braced himself, every nerve taut, ready to leap back into the river if necessary. But what he saw in those eyes stopped him cold. There was no hostility, no panic, only awareness. The animal let out a soft exhale, its body relaxing back against the mud. Its gaze lingered on Jacob a moment longer before drifting toward the forest. In that instant, Jacob felt something shift deep inside him, a silent acknowledgement, a fragile trust passing between two beings who had no reason to trust each other. Jacob swallowed hard, emotion rising in his throat. He had expected fear, danger, maybe even violence. What he found instead was recognition. The deer rested for several more minutes, its breathing growing steadier, its muscles trembling less. At last, with slow determination, it gathered itself and pushed unsteadily to its feet. Jacob scrambled back, giving it space, watching as the animal stood tall again, water dripping from its coat. It turned its head once more toward him. The forest waited just beyond, freedom only a few strides away. But in that pause, in the brief meeting of eyes, Jacob felt the enormity of the moment. He hadn't just saved a life. He had touched something far older, far deeper than himself. Without a sound, the deer stepped forward, vanishing into the trees. Jacob sat frozen, the silence of the forest pressing down on him. His chest ached with exhaustion, his hands stung from rope burns, his body trembled with fatigue, but none of it mattered. He would never forget those eyes, that silent exchange, the moment when the boundary between human and wild seemed to dissolve. Jacob remained on the riverbank long after the deer had disappeared into the trees. The forest seemed unchanged. Birds began to call again. The water flowed as it always had, but to him, everything felt different. His muscles still throbbed, his palms still burned with the sting of rope, yet inside him was a calm he couldn't explain. He replayed the moment over and over, the desperate cries, the thrashing water, the split-second choices that had nearly cost him everything. He thought of the deer's eyes in those final seconds before it left, steady and unafraid. It hadn't been gratitude in the human sense, but it had been something just as powerful. Recognition. A fleeting acknowledgement that, for one impossible morning, predator and prey, man and beast, had shared the same fragile thread of survival. As Jacob loaded his gear back into the kayak, the reality struck him. He hadn't just saved a life. He had been changed by it. The river no longer seemed like a place of sport or escape. It was something greater, something alive, with stories that ran deeper than any human could see. He pushed his kayak back into the water, letting the current carry him downstream. The mist had burned away now, revealing sunlight glimmering across the ripples. Yet he felt as though he carried the fog with him. The mystery, the weight of the unseen, the reminder that nature still held truths beyond human understanding. That night, Jacob told no one what had happened. Not yet. It felt too raw, too sacred to reduce to words. But as days passed, he found himself drawn back to that spot on the river, scanning the tree line, half expecting to see a silhouette watching him from the shadows. And sometimes, just sometimes, he swore he did. The story of that morning would never leave him. It was not just about a rescue. It was about connection, about the fragile bridge between worlds that so rarely touch. And it was a reminder, etched deep into his soul, that compassion, even when it comes at a risk, has the power to turn the impossible into the unforgettable.